Redditors who made a lot of money by sheer randomness. What's your story? I bought a waterproof camera back in 2010, and thought it would be cool to try it out at the new water park that just opened. 1 year later, the video blew up, making me tons of money monthly. I still make some during the summer months, but not much. Now I'm sitting at just over 100 million views. In the 90s, I fostered a dog for some friends who were leaving town and left the dog with me. This dog immediately made an impression upon me, and even though I really didn't want a pet at the time, he was such an amazing dog, he convinced me otherwise. He was super smart, half black lab, half pit bull. I called him Wisdom because he was so smart. Fast forward a few years, I used him as a mascot for a recording studio I set up. I registered the domain name, wisdom.com. My dog passed away several years later and I was heartbroken and depressed for many years. I maintained the domain name even though I didn't really have any projects associated with it. Over the years people made offers on the domain name, but I always passed. The domain was a homage to my long-lost best friend. Then in 2000, with the .com boom, there was renewed interest in domains and IPOs. I had a few groups bugging me for the domain name and kept increasing their offers. Eventually the numbers got into the life-changing areas of money, and I couldn't ignore them. I originally secured the wisdom.com domain name for nothing. In the early days of the internet, it didn't cost any money to register a domain name. You just had to fill out the right forms. I actually would never have to pay any domain renewal fees if it wasn't for a sysadmin that made changes to the domain and accepted new terms of service that forced me to have to pay renewal fees. Otherwise, the $475,000 I was ultimately offered in cash would have been pure profit. But instead my cost was a few $100s over the year. Still a significant windfall that gave me the opportunity to take that money and create another cool community of wonderful people. I continue to be in awe that my little dog, Wisdom, had the ability to bestow such an amazing gift upon me so many years later, and I'm determined to use that gift to help others. I took the money to create a special space that is a makerspace and club to help others. My great-aunt and godmother was a lesbian. Her partner, my Auntie Kitty, had been with her since the 1950s, when my godmother moved to New York City to work for as a magazine photographer. Auntie Kitty was disowned by her family when it came out she was with a woman. My godmother died when I was 12 and left my Auntie Kitty everything in her will, which made things strained with my dad's family, though my dad and one of his brothers still talked to her. I moved to New York at 18 for school and, knowing no one else in the city, we became close. She was thrilled that I wanted to have a relationship with her and spend time with her and didn't hesitate to think of her as my aunt, even though she technically wasn't. She was legit the greatest, and we spent holidays together and she would come to things I worked on and I knew all her friends and she knew mine. I basically spent a decade with her, being like another grandmother to me. As she got older, she'd repeatedly remind me I was the executor of her will, that I was to follow it to a T, and none of her family was to get anything. I got the bulk, my dad and uncle got some, and my sister and my nieces a little. I knew the woman had money. She had a vacation home in the Carolinas and a brownstone in NYC, but since they were bought in the 70s, I figured outside of real estate, there wasn't much. I was very wrong, and inherited enough that potentially I wouldn't have to work ever again if I didn't feel like it. To know if it's really sheer random. My partner passed away suddenly and unexpectedly from a massive seizure. Had seizures before, but nothing that would indicate he'd die from one, and he hadn't even turned 40. About 3 months later, I find he had a life insurance policy I didn't know about, and made me primary beneficiary. It gave me enough to buy a house, donate to a few causes he cared about, and still have a nest egg to start a real retirement savings off of. I miss him every day. But I guess his last act of love was setting me up for the future, even without him being there. My wife and I got some stock options when the part of the company we worked for spun off from a much larger corporation. They weren't worth much when we got them. This was the 90s, though, and every tech stock was going up. Eventually, we jokingly decided that we'd sell when the stock price got high enough to pay off the house, after we paid the taxes. Well, one day, right before we were about to leave on vacation, it got there. We briefly thought about holding out for more, but nope, we cashed out and left. In the 2 weeks we were gone, the stock price surged up and then crashed, never to see those levels again. In fact, the stock crashed below $1. The company did a 10-to-1 reverse split. I think they did this twice. It eventually went below $1 again, and the stock was delisted. Funny thing is that a lot of our friends told us we were crazy to sell. One friend even exercised his options when we did but put the proceeds into the stock market, without having saved any money aside for taxes. We did really well on the deal, but it was a combination of luck and our combined conservative fiscal nature. I cut my elder neighbor's yard growing up and helped him with random things around the house. He passed away while I was in college. Came home one weekend and I have a letter in the mail. It was from my old neighbor's attorney advising me he left me his house, money and 2 cars. I was fairly close with the guy, but never knew he had no family at all. Immediately sold the cars, I rent the house out, and I invested 50% of the money. When I was younger, a friend of my brother's asked me to buy him beer. He said he would throw me a couple bucks for my time, so I said sure. I meet up with him at the store and he hands me a $20 gold coin. With my coin knowledge being very low, something about the coin made me curious. I bought the beer with my own money, he threw me $10 and we were all good. When I got home I went online to see the value of the coin. Low end was around $1,000. I took the coin to a collector who basically gave me the value in gold weight, at the time about $1,250. Easiest $1,260 I've ever made. I worked at a local restaurant job as a line cook for about 1 month, and we were paid bi-weekly. After a month, the general manager laid me, and one other guy off because they weren't making enough money to pay us, and we were the newest people on the totem pole. I'm 100% positive I received 2 paychecks. For whatever reason, about 2 years later, I received a letter from the headquarters of the company for a potential check of $1,000, and they apologized for not paying me. Again, I swear I got all of my money, but since I have a common first and last name, I think they got me confused with someone. Being the honest person I am, I called the headquarters and gave my social security number, but they insisted I was the right person. I have no idea how it happened. I still think the entire thing was an error, but I received an approximate $1,000 paycheck. Parents died when I was in my 20s and I inherited a small buttload of money. The real kicker was the house I grew up in. It was a 3-bedroom single family with an attached business in Boston. I was an absentee landlord for a while from another state but decided it was too much of a pain in the ass, so I sold it. Look up what a 3-bedroom house goes for in Boston. A dude sat next to me on a bench and we had small talk for like 15 minutes, then he got up to leave, shook my hand and walked off. He'd planted $900 right in my hand. Was so random and smooth. I like to think I was the chosen one because I have a dazzling personality. But my friend thinks it's just because I look homeless and the dude took pity on me. Either way, it was awesome. I was on a business trip that passed through Lake Tahoe. 3 people in 1 hotel room, so I went down to the casino to get some space. Couldn't find a blackjack table to lose my $100 at, so I sat down at a Wheel of Fortune slot machine instead. 10 minutes later, I'm absent-mindedly pressing the spin max bet and hit the progressive jackpot. $1.1 million. It's the sort of thing you assume never happens, but it did. Took a lump payment of $690,000, which after I pay taxes next week will end up being about $390,000. I quickly got a financial advisor, bought my car, now own a couple investment properties, and bought my now wife a ring. Everything else is quite literally the exact same, except I have an epic story to tell to strangers on Reddit. I've been investing lately and doing a lot of day trading, and on one of the trading subreddits there was this massive hype about this stock, and how it was about to explode and people were suggesting everyone go all in. Since I'm crazy, I put $10K at 2.05 and exited at 11.40 and suddenly became $50,000 richer. I don't think I will ever get that lucky again. So that was the first and the last time I make a huge life decision based on Reddit. My grandfather was a big animal vet out in the country. He was driving home one night and noticed a guy on the side of the road trying to calm a horse, and not doing well. My grandfather stopped and helped the man and found the horse was having a medical issue that he helped fix. After everything was done, my grandfather put the horse in a trailer he luckily had connected to the truck and gave the man, Joe, a ride home. Joe wanted to pay my grandfather but he refused, so Joe took the money he was going to pay and invested it. My grandfather kinda passively agreed and moved on. 15 years later a young man came by my grandfather's home. The young man was Joe's son and had come by to let my grandfather know Joe had passed and he was closing all his father's accounts. Joe had invested $200 for 15 years and turned it into $1.2 million. In the 1960s. He paid off all his bills, expanded his farm, sent all of his children to college, and 10 years later fulfilled his dream of moving to Alaska and retired. He also gave the 5 oldest grandchildren, including me, $5,000 for our 21st birthdays. Note, he never got to meet any of the other grandchildren, not like he just didn't give a shit after the first 5. He also kept working until he was 62. One time I was walking down the street downtown, and a guy came out of a bank, got in his car, and sped off. Cash flew out of the windows. Everybody on the street was confused for a minute, but not me. I started grabbing that cash, and once it was all claimed, I went back to work and kept my mouth shut. Turns out, that was a bank robber making his getaway. He ended up getting caught later that afternoon and presumably went to prison, but I ended up with a cool $84. He probably dropped $200 total, so I really took the lion's share. Not bad considering it was more than I made in a day at the time. Thank you for watching.